Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. Today is a very special episode of the podcast. Returning to the show after getting engaged to me for reasons that still pass my imagination, but I'm glad she said yes, is Elizabeth Ferreira. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back on, the Pod Nation.
Pod Nation,
Yeah.
yes, as our friends Matthew and Taylor, who are now our housemates, refer to it all the time. Shout out to Matthew and Taylor. So if you don't know, Elizabeth is an associate MFT, associate therapist in California. That means that she's working toward her license. She focuses on somatic work with people in particular. And the populations of people that you work with are often dealing with issues related to trauma, complex PTSD, dissociation, attachment wounding, a lot of different stuff like that. And so the questions that we got for this mailbag all sort of orbited those different topics, as you would probably imagine. And I'm just really looking forward to doing this with you.
Yay. I'm excited. Let's talk about trauma.
Jeez. Okay, so the first question that we got was about internal family systems therapy, which Elizabeth uses a fair amount in her practice. Yeah, as a general model, and the relationship between IFS and somatic therapy. So here we go. I listened to your recent episode on internal family systems with Dr. Richard Schwartz. He's the guy who created IFS.
The OG.
Yes, the OG himself. And of course, your earlier episodes with Elizabeth. Is there any crossover or relationship between IFS and somatic therapy? How do they work together?
Oh, okay. This is actually a complicated question.
Yes.
So
they're all complicated questions, Elizabeth. Don't worry.
So for starters, if people are interested in a more somatic approach to IFS, I would look up Janina Fisher's work. And kind of her take and where I'm gaining more of my training through that model is this understanding that parts are connected to nervous system states. And so you can kind of map out the parts based on like the fight response, the flight response, the freeze, the submit and attach part of our nervous system. And each part within maybe one of those domains has its own strategy, has its own connection to the body, what it does. And you can track that as a somatic therapist. You can kind of see it happen as it's happening in front of you. That's a little different than the OG Richard Schwartz, which is kind of like, we're going to go into the mind and I'm really going to have you, bring the part to the water and, like envision this kind of transformational experience.
Sure. And IFS also, it's a model of how the brain is structured or how personality is structured, which includes all of these different aspects. They talk about managers and firefighters and exiles, all these different kind of pieces of terminology. The overall point of which, as Richard said during our conversation together, is to help us understand ourselves more holistically. It's also how he just believes functionally the mind is truly structured. And to help people better understand why they might have these competing desires inside of themselves. But that model can be applied to that understanding of the mind. You can apply that to essentially any way of approaching therapy.
Yeah.
It's a broad model. It's not a specific technique per se. Now, in IFS, they've come up with a lot of really cool techniques for how to access these different parts. They call them like direct access, these ways of thinking about things. But you can take a more top-down or a more bottom-up approach, as somatics is, to IFS the same way that you could take a more top-down or a more bottom-up approach to, really most other forms of therapy. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, no, I would say that's just kind of how I do IFS is through a bottom-up approach because that's my training. And I think because I view parts as being so connected to those nervous system states, it's like a tracking of like, okay, this is where the nervous system is. These are the parts that are starting to show up. Great, cool. How do we get the person to become aware of what's happening? And that's kind of the work with Janina Fisher's stuff is helping a person who is highly fragmented, who maybe is more resistant to other types of therapy, meaning that it just hasn't really worked for them. It's a way of kind of sewing things back together in a way. And often that begins with there's a sensation happening. Can you connect to the sensation? Can you become aware of what nervous system state you're in? Okay, great. Now what does that part need? And it's about getting to the wants and needs of those parts.
Yeah. So to spend a little bit more time here, and just because there's so much that's cool in IFS, when you say highly fragmented, what do you mean by that?
My perspective is that trauma fragments self, in that pieces of who we are kind of get fragmented off, and that's how we get multiple parts. So the more trauma, say, a person has experienced, the more parts, the more fragmentation.
Gotcha. So all of these different little sub-personalities bopping around.
Yeah.
Great.
So on one spectrum, like the really intense form of that would be more like dissociative disorders. And in the most intense kind of description, that's like DID, where there's a degree of like amnesia when a part comes online, meaning that the person is maybe not aware that they're in a part or that that part is taken over. But in less severe forms, they can say, well, there's this part of me that feels this way, and then there's this other part that feels that way. There's less amnesia towards the fragmented experience.
More self-awareness. It's
more self-awareness.
Yeah, you can like pull it up on demand.
Yeah. So I tend to work within that kind of spectrum and thinking about, okay, how many parts are here? How many parts are you aware of, right? And it's all about getting to, how do we care for these parts? What does the part need in order to come back into a form of integration? Which, what do we even mean by that? Again, this is a very complicated question. I think for me, the way that I would describe it is you're just aware. You're just very aware of, oh, there's that part. This is what this part is trying to get me to understand about myself or attune to. And now I can meet that need. And now that feeling or that part has softened and relaxed. And I am the one in control. I am the one that is like making the choices, having agency.
Something that I've heard you talk about that I find really interesting is how different parts will respond differently to different kinds of like inquiry from the therapist. So what I mean by that is you've mentioned how manager parts generally prefer to be a little cognitive. They prefer that world of thinking and planning and organizing and thinking about a feeling as opposed to actually feeling about a feeling. While other parts, maybe younger parts, exiles in the language of IFS, that kind of stuff, tend to be a bit better accessed in general by more bottom-up somatic forms of work. For starters, is that more or less accurate? And then I'm just curious about working with managers in general, because that can be something people really struggle with.
I mean, sounds true to me.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm like,
yeah, just from your experience.
Yeah,
totally.
you know, checks out. Yeah, I would say the exiled parts are more somatic, and because they tend to be farther away from consciousness at times, they come up as like a feeling or as like maybe a discomfort or something's happening, you know? Managers, in my experience, are the ones that you're interacting with the most, especially in the beginning of therapy. Yeah. They usually are the ones that are really good about, okay, here's what's happening. This is what's going on. Yeah, I'm aware of this, yada, 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 yada. And so it's a real kind of dance, because you do have to attune to the managers and make them feel safe and kind of understand what they need. But you don't want to do that to the detriment of these younger parts, or perhaps these more vulnerable parts that are kind of behind the managers. So it's about attuning to the whole system.
Yeah.
And the more you can look at someone sort of from like the whole trees, rather than getting caught like in the forest with the person, when you can kind of look at the whole thing from like a bird's eye view, you're able to kind of notice the patterns that the parts do. And then it's about, okay, where is there a little bit of room for a different experience? Where is there a little bit of space to maybe, and this is where it gets, edgy, for me to be like, hey, are you aware that you're in a manager right now? Right? Like making that reflection. And that takes time. And you have to get to know the person as the therapist and paying attention to the whole system. And then learning where the system is naturally giving you space to enter that system, to maybe have a healing experience or a reparative experience.
Yeah, something with that, like observing the manager that you're talking about, telling somebody, hey, you're in a manager part right now. Something I've heard you say is that managers really don't like being observed.
No.
And I'm wondering, why you think that is. What does that mean? How can that be helpful for people to know?
So I think part of the reason why I'm struggling maybe with this question is because we are talking about it in a very cognitive way, when I experience this as almost being beyond words when you're in the room with someone. So we're talking about it theoretically, but I work with it practically. And it's very difficult to describe in words the somatic realm of parts. As long as you are reading about parts work or watching a video on it or reading a book about it, you are staying in a theoretical space with it. And to invite the somatic space, you have to invite an experience. You have to first have the felt experience of what it's like to have someone observing your part. There's something somatic about being witnessed that is an ephemeral yet intense body-based feeling that is often very uncomfortable for people to experience the first time, because we spend so much of our life in the theoretical. We spend so much of our life like talking about the thing rather than experiencing the thing. Being witnessed by someone who can actually attune to your nervous system and your parts is destabilizing. And your manager parts try to maintain a degree of stabilization. And so that's why just observing the manager parts start to invoke a somatic experience, because just by being witnessed in that way is destabilizing to the system.
So this wasn't a question that we actually got, but I'm going to steal the mailbag in order to ask you a question right now that I think is something we do hear about a lot from people who listen. You were just saying a second ago about that capacity to think about something, learn about it, listen to a podcast about IFS or complex PTSD, whatever else. And because of all of those tools that are out there these days, people are much more psychoeducated than they used to be, which 98% of that is fantastic. The 2% of it that can be a little challenging for people are people who are kind of like the person that you described, where they're walking in the door, you ask them, hey, why are you here? And they can tell you, they can write a master's thesis on their personal history, including, these things happened to me and they affected me in these kinds of ways. And now I have these different coping behaviors. And, typically when I'm doing this, I kind of wander into like more of a left brain thing. And when I'm doing this, I'm more in a, and so on and so on and so on, That person has cultivated all of this awareness, but they're sitting in your room for a reason. They're sitting in your room because it hasn't helped them solve their problem. They're still having whatever experience or symptoms or, just like not quite getting out of life what they want to get out of it. And for starters, I'm wondering how you feel about that broadly. And then also, what helps somebody who's there, who has all of that education, all of that awareness, to actually like use that to get more of what they want?
When I was listening to you say that, the word that just kept popping in my head was the experience. I'm going to be utterly revealed for a moment.
We love utterly revealed.
It's quite frustrating for me to work with that type of person you're describing, because it can very easily feel like you're kind of fighting with their protective structure a bit. And this is where we get the very archaic word, the client is resistant, which I don't buy into. It's all protection. And what is the system protecting? 99% of the time, pain.
Yeah, vulnerable experiences, painful emotions, absolutely, yeah.
And here's the thing. The body likes things to be very simple. Pain. You're trying to avoid pain.
Yeah.
You don't want to feel pain. But the irony is that in order for you to integrate some of your parts, you have to re-experience the pain that pushed them into the unconscious in the first place. Because we get fragmented through experiences of pain without having a degree of co-regulation and attunement to be able to process that pain. So it's perceived as unbearable, so I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to put it over there. I'm going to not think about it. So all of this, like, thinking about it and I can blah, 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 like, it's a person's attempt to think their way out of a feeling, and that's just impossible. You can't think your way out of this. So often what that's like in the room is I'm the one feeling all the feelings that person is avoiding. Because as a somatic therapist and as someone who's very sensitive, I'm not just attuning to the manager parts, I'm trying to attune to the whole system. So you're able to, and the more time you spend with someone, you're able to kind of feel the subtle nuances of like implicit triggers of like, oh, there was something right there and it happened so fast. And now you're telling me about the last book of Richard Schwartz that you read and how you're really processing your firefighters right now. And I'm like, wait, what just happened there? So it's about, with someone like that, it's about slowing them down to be able to have an experience. And an experience is a felt experience.
Yeah.
Even if it just lasts for a second.
Yeah. What's cool about this is that people tend to think about somatic approaches to therapy as these like very modern approaches. People have started hearing about somatic work more in the last decade, really. It started considerably before then, but like that's when it became more popularized. But this gets back to the roots of Western therapy, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic therapy, the return of the repressed, this whole idea that there are these painful experiences. We don't want to feel them, but they kind of got to go somewhere. They don't just vanish into history. We have a long memory. There are these things that we've been running away from for a long period of time. For some people, for their whole life, they've been running away from a certain kind of experience. And if they find that they've done a lot of work, but for whatever reason, they haven't been able to quite crack that nut, a lot of the time it's because there is some unprocessed or unfelt experience that is still kind of kicking around in there. And in my general experience, somatics is a great way to access that material, often in conjunction with like an overall model, something like IFS. So the two can work together really effectively.
And just, I know we have other questions, but again, this was a complicated question.
It's a big question.
It's a big question.
What you gonna do?
What you just said to me when I hear that is, what is the motivation for reading all the books and listening to all the podcasts and doing this intense psychoanalysis of yourself? Is it because you're still in a way running away from something, or do you do it because it actually helps you feel more? Most of the time, people aren't doing it to feel more. Most of the time, they're looking for the solution so that they don't have to feel anything.
Great.
And I'm like, well, when that doesn't work, you can give me a call.
You know where to find me. You got my email address. All right. So that was great. And all of these questions are ones where honestly we could do a whole episode on them and really dig into them. But that's the nature of the questions we get. We have really interested listeners, which is always awesome. I'm going to move on here to our second kind of group of questions, which had to do with dissociation and emotional numbing, particularly for people who have complex PTSD. So we're just like square in your area of expertise here. All my life, I feel like I've focused on other people's needs and wants to the point where I have difficulty connecting with myself and knowing what I want. I sometimes experience disconnection when I am out socializing to the point where I sort of freeze and can no longer interact with other people. When this happens, should I just leave? Or are there real-time practices that can help us reconnect with ourselves? And I'd love to hear about some of these practices that help us do this in general.
So what I hear when I'm taking in that question is I'm hearing someone who had to self-abandon, had to hyper attune to other people, who probably now is incredibly highly sensitive to the energies in a group dynamic or even just one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes up a lot of that person's energy and awareness to where it's pushing, like there's not a whole lot of room for them to attune to themselves, hear what they need, and kind of track what's happening inside of themselves.
Yeah, I think you nailed.
I return to the question of capacity. To me, capacity is about our window of presence. How much can we tolerate being in an experience or doing a thing before the fuzz starts to come in? Because if we're talking about more dissociative states, right? The fuzz, the dissociation is a sign that we're reaching capacity. We are entering a state of overwhelm. And we dissociate as a form of protection, a form of like, oh, this is too overwhelming, so I'm going to, right? So from a very basic somatic level, it's how long can you tolerate that experience while staying in your body? And how hard do you have to work to stay in your body? So sometimes for me, because I dissociate, if I'm in an experience where I'm kind of similar to what this question is asking, right? I move my body in subtle ways to try to keep some form of contact in it. And if I can track myself and feel the fuzz start to come in, or the tiredness or the slowing down, or I'm like, wow, I'm really struggling to kind of think, I just like start to like touch my hands, or I'll kind of like move a little bit just to get some type of input in my body. And then it's about, again, tracking my own capacity. There are some situations where it doesn't matter how much tapping I do. It's not going to matter how much I jump up and down. If it's too much, I'm gone, like, pew. And then one of my other parts will step in to like, wear a mask and get me through it. But am I fully present? No, because I'm at capacity. So taking all of these elements for this question, it's about learning to track yourself first and honoring when you can tell, oh, I'm done. I'm at my limit. And being okay with however short that may be. Like it may be 5 minutes. It may be less. And going, okay, that's enough for me. I need to take a break. I need to kind of have a different experience, and kind of honoring that. And learning how to regulate yourself in that way of like, what actually helps me be here more, which is about safety.
For the part of the question that's about the wants and needs aspect of it, hyper attuning to other people, really tracking what's going on inside of them, and alongside that, not having such a good sense for what's going on internally, which includes what you're describing, which is this sense of like an internal thermostat, and knowing when the heat gets too hot or too cold, and that takes you into a certain kind of state where you can no longer be in relationship with other people. What do you think helps people develop a little bit of a more like granular sense of what's going on inside of them, so they can become more aware of that over time? Like, are there things that you've done to become more aware of that?
Well, for me, it's a somatic experience. Like I said, I start to struggle to think, which then affects my ability to communicate. I lose visual focus. Everything starts to get a little dull and a little fuzzy visually. My body starts to feel far away. Like I'm not in it. Like I'm not feeling stuff, everything starts to feel like I'm watching a movie of something happening versus I am participating in the movie. And I think what's helped me gain that ability to track myself has frankly from my own therapy of having someone able to mirror and reflect back that I was dissociating and able to catch me and go, wait, are you here? And it's like, wait a minute, am I? Because for me, dissociative states have become so normal that it was very difficult for me to tell if I'm dissociated or not at a certain point in my experience. And so what helped me was having a highly attuned person for the first time kind of go, hey, you're not here right now. How do we help you get here? And I'm like, I don't know. I wasn't even aware I wasn't fully here. Okay, well, let's just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what helps. And it's through that trial and error that you're like, oh, okay.
Can I ask you about the anger piece of this?
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of orbiting this as I'm thinking about it right now and talking about it with you. But for people who are that hyper tuned, very focused on wants and needs of other people, not so much focus on their own wants and needs, I wonder how much of that comes from a place of having a difficult time feeling and expressing anger, particularly towards other people, because there can be this natural push away of others when you feel like their content is getting too kind of close to you, or this feeling of sort of, no, I do want to focus on what I need. Like, no, I don't want to be so focused on what's going on over there. And people who disassociate, it's often like more of a freeze response, not so much a fight response. And so I wonder about kind of helping somebody rev up the nervous system or rev themselves up so that they can kind of get more of the energy associated with that. And I know that that's been at least a little bit of part of your adventure with this. And so I'm wondering what you
Forrest,
think
now
about
you're
this.
just really flirting with me
I know,
because you're bringing in anger.
I'm giving you catnip. No, it's totally true. But anyways, so I know this is something that you've really thought about, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit more skillfully than I have. I feel like I'm kind of orbiting an idea, but I'm having a hard time articulating it.
Yeah. So where I feel this whole question, where I can connect with it, is I grew up in a household where I was really not allowed to say no.
Yeah. And that's a lot of these people who feel this way. Yeah, totally.
Not allowed to say no. Not allowed to have healthy protest. And you, growing up developmentally, you need to be able to tell your parents no.
Yeah.
And beyond the terrible twos, no. Like, you need to have that experience of it's safe to have healthy protest. It's safe to have a boundary. It's safe to push back.
Yeah, you need to be allowed to have and explore your preferences as an individual.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I wasn't allowed to do that. That was not, what was highlighted was you are obedient, you do as your parents say, and you are not allowed to say no. So what that's doing on a somatic level is I'm having a fight response, which is anger most of the time, is I'm having the experience of energy build, it's wanting to come out, but now I'm in an environment where if I do that, I'm going to be punished. So what do I do as an adaptive strategy? I take that natural force that should be going out and I turn it inward. And this becomes the force of dissociation.
Yeah, you're slamming the gas and the brake at the same time.
Yeah. So it's unsafe for me to fight. So instead, I'm going to hold that energy and push it down. And what I feel that does in my system is it creates that dissociation where I'm not here at this point, because that was my adaptive strategy whenever I felt that response come on, because I knew I can't yell. I knew I can't say no. So I submit. What I've found in my work is that it's really important to relearn that having a healthy fight response is just that. It's healthy. And that's the force, that's the energy that helps us have boundaries. That's the energy. Having a fight response, that healthy protest, can be when we're in a group of people and someone's oversharing, or we can feel the psychic load of their stuff and go like, you need to stop. I love you dearly and I can't handle anymore.
Yeah, I'm a little maxed out
I'm
here.
maxed.
Yeah.
I still want to be here, but if you're going to continue this, I'm out.
Yeah.
Instead of feeling you can't say that and you have to just.
Yeah. And I think that this is one of those things where we could do a whole episode on it. And maybe we should. If people want a whole episode on this, let us know. Two things really stand out to me. First is finding different ways to express that kind of fight response that are accessible to you and graduated to a situation appropriately. So an example of what you were saying there, okay, somebody's talking about something that maybe it's slightly triggering for you, maybe it's activating, maybe you're just like really complete with this person talking to you, whatever's going on. You might not be in a situation where it's socially appropriate for you to like literally get up and walk away. But there are versions of getting up and walking away inside of the theater of your own imagination. Maybe you're expressing something to them, maybe you're trying to change the topic. Maybe you just start kind of thinking about something else in an active way where it's not a dissociated state, but you're just like, look, I'm going to spend some time in my mind palace here for a minute and have a good time with myself. And then the second piece of this is that for somebody who tends to struggle with the fight response in general, tiny things. Oh, actually, I would like to go to whatever. Oh, I would really prefer it if fill in the blank. Can feel like these just enormous, like catastrophic bids to them when another person would receive those as like, oh, no big deal. And so I think that some of it is about understanding that these little bids that you're making early on as you try to do this kind of work might feel really big, even if they aren't so big. And so other people will probably receive them in ways that are like, oh, okay, not such a big deal. Of course, it's going to depend. That's very personal. But I wonder about that part of it, like developing the awareness that like, look, this is going to feel like a really big action, even if it isn't so much of one initially.
Yeah, I'm noticing I want to kind of mention something specific to trauma.
Yeah.
In my experience as someone with C-PTSD and someone who's worked with C-PTSD, the domain of wants and needs is really intense and it's really complicated. And most people, like there was a time in myself where if you asked me what I wanted or what I needed, I couldn't answer that because I was so confused internally. And also, based on my lived experience, it was never safe for me to actually say what I want or what I needed. That's all stuff that I had to keep inside of myself. So I just want to add that when we're working with a system that has experienced developmental complex trauma, what we're talking about, takes a very long time because there are all these protective strategies that I've learned. It's not okay for me to have wants and needs. And the adaptation is I meet everybody else's wants and needs. And that keeps somebody safe. So to move into what about my wants and needs can be triggering. It can be really activating and cause a lot of dysregulation and stress. So I just want to name, like, as we're talking about it, it may sound kind of simple, but it's not.
Yeah, no, this is like a huge topic for people and it's really challenging.
And, just to like say, sometimes I still feel sick to my stomach when I'm like, babe, I have a need.
Well, this is actually a great example where we're going to do at some point a whole episode on attachment wounding and relationships and our relationship and being somebody with complex PTSD inside of a relationship, all of that. We've been together now for 7.5 years, almost 8 years. And it's really only been over the last year or two that you've started to say things to me like, oh, I actually prefer it when you rub my legs this different kind of way. Which is sort of wild if you think about it. Like it took us 7 years to get to like, I would prefer a head scratch with a slightly different level of pressure, you know? Like the most benign ask that a person could possibly have about an incredibly low stakes thing. And even so, that's the work.
Yeah.
And then when you have ideally a partner who responds to it well or a friend who responds to it well, that's a little reparative experience. It goes okay. You feel, ooh, I can take a big breath around it. I'm sure it's still quite activating. And then you can make these other little bits, and they sort of escalate naturally over time until you feel more and more comfortable doing this sort of thing.
Yeah.
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 Okay, so let's move on to the next one here. Okay, emotional numbing, which is an aspect of dissociation. What's emotional numbing, and how can people move past emotional numbing and actually start to feel their feelings again?
So what do you think this person is trying to ask with this question? Because I'm noticing that I'm really struggling to even kind of like understand it.
Oh, okay. I think that they're trying to I think they're saying something like, I've gotten into a state that's probably a little dysthymia adjacent, where I just feel kind of down a lot of the time. I feel right there in the question, sort of numb. Like I can't access really positive feelings. I also even can't really access really negative feelings. It all just feels kind of blah internally. I'm sort of shut down. And I don't like that. It's not good for my life. And I want to know what I can do differently to kind of start to access some stronger feelings again.
Well, with that, that makes me think about functional freeze.
I think they're totally talking about that.
And I think why I'm about emotional numbing is because I think in terms of parts. Like, just because you may not be experiencing an intense feeling or emotion or something like that doesn't mean that like it's not happening. And
Yeah,
I
so
think
focus on this. Yeah, this is great.
And so what I think is that there is actually something that is so intense that the system is numbing out, moving into functional freeze, outside of window of capacity. So, like, it's not like someone consciously is emotional numbing. To me, I'm very like, okay, what really adaptive part is running the show? Why is it maybe safer to be in this state than not? How does this state of emotional numbing serve you? How is it making your life more bearable? What would happen if it wasn't there? How does that feel to think about that? So yeah, I guess I just get like, I immediately move into like conceptualizing it as a part.
So you think that this is a protective strategy, at least in some cases, by a piece of the whole ecosystem to probably avoid more highly painful feelings that could come up for somebody. And so it's taken the floor up, but it's also pushed the ceiling down. Yeah. And it's staying inside of like a very narrow adaptive range.
Yeah.
If you were working with somebody who was bringing that to you as a clinician, what would you start looking at?
I would start with doing a lot of mirroring and kind of reflecting these little elements like the frustration, the apathy, the desire to feel more, but then the commitment to not actually want to feel a whole lot. I would also get really curious about how this person feels being perceived by other people. Is there a shoulda, woulda, coulda in there? I should be feeling more. The shame of it. Like, oh, I should be different. And exploring like, well, should you?
Yeah, where this question gets complicated is around issues of temperament.
Yeah.
Because people have different temperaments. Some people run really hot and really cold.
Yeah.
Some people are kind of more neutral. And so in a question like this, it's sort of hard to say for the person asking it, are they somebody who just naturally has a flatter temperament, which is very difficult to work with. It's very hard to change temperament.
Yeah.
Or were there experiences this person had that led to the development of this functional freeze as a coping strategy? And that's what you're really highlighting. And then if that's the case, if the person is walking into the room and they're coming to it more from that perspective, well, then you're into trauma work. You're doing parts work, or you're exploring the nature of the feeling. What is this protecting you from? All of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think like that's a really important distinction. Like my lens is through that trauma lens. It's through that parts work lens. So every question I'm hearing is going through that bias. I'm like, okay, I'm conceptualizing it in the way that I've been trained and the way that I focus. But I think what makes it kind of challenging to answer a question like this is that may just be not the experience.
Sure.
A person just may have a more narrow range compared to what they're perceiving another person having.
Yeah.
And that's where it's then like maybe a degree of curiosity is like, well, are you happy the way you are? Because if you are, then great. If you're unhappy, are you unhappy because people are telling you you're a flat affect person and you're too cognitive and you should be feeling more? I don't know about that either. Or is it because you feel something important is getting cut off?
Something's missing.
Something important in you is missing. That's my work. Is like, okay, we can work there. The other stuff.
And also that's in some ways more of like either a self-acceptance practice or a practice of inner authority around, no, I actually feel really okay about the way that I am.
Yeah.
And people are saying this thing to me, but to be honest, I don't even really get what the problem is. But people are telling me I should be worried about this. So, hey, I'm going to go and be worried about it. So a lot of this kind of diagnostically is about figuring out what's real for a person inside of their experience and what are the reasons that somebody is walking into the room for you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Totally.
Yep.
Cool. All right. I would love any tips on how to calm down hypervigilance. How can I stay present and aware of my body's sensing and signals without letting that drive my mind toward more catastrophic thinking? So hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance. To keep it very sort of tools in the toolboxy kind of thing.
We love tools in the toolbox.
One, growing mindfulness to be aware when you are in that hypervigilant state. Using that mindfulness to track what that state feels like when you are in it. And then really building that bridge between the body's experience and what your mind starts to do. So kind of noticing the type of thoughts you have when you're in a state of hypervigilance. And then going, are those thoughts true? Are those thoughts actually, the more that I think about them, are they actually alleviating the hypervigilance, or are they keeping me here? Are they sort of feeding the state? Am I in a loop of hypervigilance now because now I'm thinking about hypervigilant thoughts and how. So in that way, it's about having that mindfulness. Okay, this is what's happening. And then where there are places to invite a different experience, whether that be if you're more top down, I'm not going to think about that. The thought may pop up. Okay, let the thought go, right? Kind of trying to distract yourself a little bit. Okay, how might this thought not be true, right? Then also the somatic piece of like, okay, well, do you need to go for a run? Do you need to physically move the body in a way to kind of get rid of some of that energy? Do you need to eat? Do you need to maybe slow way down and take a few breaths? Do you need to kind of self-soothe a little bit? Are you overstimulated? Do you need to kind of go into a place where it's quiet, take a moment, see if you can reset? Those are the things that kind of pop up for me with that question.
Yeah, for somebody, let's say that there is a person who has a very difficult time relaxing, kind of at all. Sit down to read a book, or, God forbid, they sit down to do a little mindfulness practice, something where they're truly kind of on their own. They can get 3, 4 minutes into it kind of okay. But by the time that the 5th minute rolls around, they're really starting to get some kind of anxious energy in the body. They're nervous, they're scanning, they're tapping their foot, the mind's starting to move. Okay, they're trying to apply these different things. They're trying to be like, okay, I'm going to self soothe. I'm going to think these more pleasant thoughts, blah, blah, blah. Elizabeth told me to do this. They're just having a really tough time with it. What do you think's going on there? And is there anything off the top that might help that person?
So what I think is happening is that the the person is slowed down enough to be in contact with the wave of activation that's happening in the body. So this comes from polyvagal theory, where it's a flexible nervous system is actually the one we are striving for. It's not that we feel good all the time. It's that we are free to go throughout these sort of waves of activation, rest and digest, kind of a little freeze here and come back up throughout the day with ease. And that's regulation, is it's the fluidity of that experience. What I'm hearing and what you're kind of bringing in is someone slowing down to be aware of feeling this, and then that being uncomfortable, because it is uncomfortable, and trying to manage it, trying to cut off the way the body is naturally regulating itself.
I wouldn't have thought about that.
And so part of it is, it's uncomfortable. Sit in the discomfort.
Can you be with it?
Can you be with it? Yeah. Can you let it happen?
And see if it goes somewhere. Yeah. I'm feeling a feeling. Can I feel this feeling while I'm reading this book?
Yeah.
Can I feel this feeling while I'm meditating?
Yeah.
Not to go full Buddhist mindfulness here, because I literally can't help myself. But like, there's actually, so in meditative practice in general, people often really misunderstand it as an attempt to not think or to not do. That's not really what's going on. Most of the time in kind of classic Theravadan tradition, you're really just trying to observe the work of the mind in a sort of dispassionate way. Often there will be some kind of a phrase of focus or a thinking phrase. A very classic one is, who is the one who is breathing, or some version like that, where you're trying to investigate issues around self. But you can think of your own versions of this. Like, what is this feeling? What's around this feeling? Is this feeling in my legs? Is this feeling in my body? Is this feeling in my mind? You can have these different kind of thinking phrases that you attune to. And so if you are truly experiencing like a hypervigilant state, that can actually be a really cool object of inquiry in a more meditative practice. You can feel like, ooh, what's going on in here, in this kind of very curious way. And bringing that curiosity to it is not always going to like solve somebody's problem. It could even intensify those feelings. So you want to be cautious and appropriate and thoughtful about how you're doing something like that. But personally, I've gotten a lot of value out of that, particularly if you are able to kind of stick with the sensation for long enough to watch it change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that always happens. But you have to be able to tolerate all the discomfort that's going to happen before it changes.
Yeah.
And that's where it can be very activating, like, okay, I'm trying to read something, but all this stuff is coming up. Oh God, like our instinct is to be like, get rid of it. Like, how do I return to a state where I wasn't feeling this? And my curiosity is, okay, what happens if you really sit in it?
Particularly when it's a feeling, like a sensation, because sitting in a thought, it's kind of turtles all the way down sometimes, where the brain can just can ruminate endlessly on a thought or an idea. But if you can really find the sensation and kind of stick with that, again, more like somatic focus, for long enough for it to become something else. And to be clear, the something else it becomes, it may not be a fun something else. I'm not telling you that this is going to be like a great time, but I'm telling you that long term, it'll be helpful if you're able to do it. For me, when I first started doing things like that, I would get very close to crying when I would do this kind of an inquiry. I would really feel the experience. I would really feel the activation, and it would turn into an emotion. And for me, the emotion was often like a cry feeling or something like that. For some people, it might be a pissed feeling. For some people, it might be a rage part. Like you talk about rage parts a lot. But whatever is there, if you really kind of stick with the sensation, often an emotion will emerge. And then you can get a lot of mileage out of investigating that emotion.
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, okay. Love this. I am currently in an internship for my clinical mental health counseling master's degree. I see my friends and clients fall into the trap of comparing trauma, pain, or negative experiences, and often disregarding their own experiences as not being bad enough to be called trauma. What do you think about this? What helps people understand that emotional pain is emotional pain, and it's not to be downplayed or compared? Yeah, big issue in the field.
So my definition of trauma is anything that the nervous system was not able to complete its cycle of like regulation with. So for some people, they can have the same exact experience, and one person, they'll feel fine, and another person is going to walk out of that being traumatized by it. So to me, there's no usefulness. There's literally no...
There's no upside.
There's no upside to trying to compare traumatic experiences. Now, in terms of being in therapy school, like my perspective on therapy school is that like a certain percentage of it is learning a bunch of theory, like writing some papers, and hopefully finding some people that you can have consultations with once you're like licensed. But the big majority of that experience is you really learning about your own material, because your material will be activated being in the room with somebody else. So it's about how open are you to really being changed by the experience of going to graduate school to become a therapist. If you're resistant, if you are like, in my perspective, that's where we get, well, it wasn't that bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, it's not like my parents hit me. We get kind of stuff like that. There's a diminishing and a downplaying of like certain experiences. And what I kind of look into that is there may be a place that that person is not ready to explore within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that the comparison is a form of protection that's coming in to be like, oh no, it wasn't that bad, or no, that's over there. I'm different. My experience was lighter compared to this other person, or my experience was so much more. Like these are all parts that are interacting with each other in a dance, trying to get their needs met. And that's why going to graduate school is messy, because everybody's parts start to like...
Yeah, I think there are a lot of aspects to the question. You can think of two different people. First person, who's the real downplaying type. You've had a lot of these people walk into your office where you sort of start to get the story. The initial version of the story is, it really wasn't so bad. As you start to explore it, 9 times out of 10, you discover it was, in fact, so bad. And
I used to be that person.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard some wild stories from Elizabeth. Then, inside of that person, it really makes sense why there would be that would be coming maybe from a desire to not feel some of the feelings that might be there, or not really kind of accept an aspect of what happened, or whatever it might be. Then you have another person that I'm really interested in, and feel compassionate toward, who is sort of on the other side of the coin. And they're looking at all of these people that in their evaluation really didn't go through much at all. But they're over here having been through these horrible experiences. And wow, we're really just downplaying the word trauma at this point. And now everybody is saying everything is trauma. But I really went through something that is truly, deeply traumatic. And there's often quite a bit of judgment from that person. That person occasionally appears in our YouTube comments about like our usage of the word trauma, or like, there are these people who are just really like softening what this word means. What do you think's going on there? Like what can be helpful for that person?
I hear in that a person that is desperate to be seen.
Yes.
And desperate to be attuned to in the way that they need.
Yeah,
that
acknowledged. Yeah.
That person, that type of person, needs something extremely specific. And they may not even know what that is, but the activation that comes up, because that's what we're talking about. Someone's getting triggered by all of this.
By a softening of the word trauma, yeah. Which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Yeah.
Right? And so, this was something that kind of looking back at my experience in graduate school, I kind of realized, oh, okay, like, I think this is what's going on here. Before I had done a ton of my own trauma work with a therapist, I would feel an intense rage come on to me when people would be like, well, it was deeply traumatizing for me because my parents could only go on one vacation instead of two.
Mm.
You know, like I would have a very intense like rage kind of come up. I would, because I was being triggered. And looking back now, I felt that way because there was no space for me in those groups, in those situations. And when I would try, I was always told to shut up because my stuff is just too intense.
Yeah. It would blow out. It would just kind of blow the whole thing out of the water
Yeah.
to some extent. Yeah.
So I have a lot of compassion for people. And part of my work has also been around letting that word become more broad so that it includes more people instead of being exclusive. Because the real pain is, okay, well, if this word gets so colloquialized, then there's not enough space for my experience in it. Or I'm no longer defined appropriately by this term. And my work is, no, let's make it big enough for everybody's experience to be in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great answer, babe. And we see this kind of dance in a lot of different places in, therapy world, psychology world. One of the big ones that shows up is with diagnostic criteria, particularly these days for autism spectrum disorders. This is really showing up as a topic because as we've broadened this terminology so much, what's happened is it's started to kind of exclude people who are really at the center of the distribution, who are higher needs or who have more things going on that they need support with for whatever reason. That like kind of softening has sort of pulled some attention away from that core group of people. But it's a real balance. You want to include people, you want to be compassionate to everyone, you want to broaden the field. And at the same time, you don't want to effectively start cutting out the people that the terminology was really initially designed for, built for. The diagnosis was really built to give that person access to a certain level of service, particularly when we're talking in terms of what ends up on somebody's permanent file or something like that. And we want to make sure that that person can still access those services in a really meaningful way for them. So I just say that to say that this is all a dance.
Yeah.
And it's all a balance. There's not really like a right answer here or a wrong answer here, other than we would like to serve as many people as possible as effectively as we can.
I think it's just human nature to take words and then they kind of morph and change their meaning.
Yeah, for sure.
But what's important is the experience of trauma.
Yeah.
And what that experience is that you have a divergent experience being in a traumatized body than someone who is not. A more typical person, let's say someone who has not experienced trauma, they're able to move through life, move through this nervous system state with a degree of flexibility. Someone who's traumatized does not have that flexibility. Things feel tight and rigid. Everything feels super hard. At any moment, you could be triggered, and life just gets way more complicated. Like things that you can understand should be easy, or you see somebody else do it and you're like, why am I struggling so much? Trauma is a form of just perpetual struggling for so many people, with the awareness of this shouldn't be this hard. And so I really get, and again, I sometimes struggle with this myself, of people who have a real criticism of folks who are like, oh, I was traumatized, you know? But when you meet people who have shared in that experience, there's that response isn't there. You're like, I get it.
All right. So one final question. This is kind of a bonus question.
Okay.
I actually think that the most popular questions that we got were essentially just about you as a person. And particularly were about somebody looking at the experiences that you've shared, including things like PMDD, complex PTSD, ADHD, the whole alphabet soup that you got going on. And then looking at going to graduate school, becoming a therapist, learning how to sit with people, earning the hours, and essentially just wondering what has supported you in that whole journey and being able to do that, particularly as you're also just dealing with the normal everyday stresses of life, maintaining a relationship, having friends, having hobbies, living a meaningful life in general. And like, what's really supported you in that? And is there anything that you would share with somebody who is also interested in maybe not doing exactly the same thing, maybe not becoming a therapist, but just something like that, like wanting to live a life like that alongside all of these various challenges? And just essentially asking you about your experience and what's helped you.
Well, I think I have a very stubborn part that kind of looks and goes, even if this kills me, even if I lose all my hair, even if I have an eczema flare, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I love that.
Like I just have like a defiance inside of me and a stubbornness that's like, well, if it kills me, then it kills me, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I think that's just something that I was kind of like born into the world with, that I actually kind of had to like reclaim. But I've always been a very driven person. And I think that's been kind of the agony for me of having like ADHD and C-PTSD and PMDD is that I think deep down in my core, if I had a more neurotypical brain and nervous system, I'd be very type A. Like I would have done
You
so
mentioned
much
stuff like that to me before, yeah.
Yeah, like I would have done so much more. Like the spice cabinet would be so organized, like everything would be in a certain file, but I just can't do that. And what's kind of helped me within that is learning how to give myself like brutal levels of self-compassion when I can no longer fight it, when I can no longer summon that deeply stubborn, defiant part of me that can go like, even if I have to drag myself, I'm going to do it, and honoring the days when I just can't.
Yeah.
And so it's been also, I think, like a process of acceptance. And then within that is figuring out like the help that I need and also the help that I deserve and I'm entitled to. Like I have ADHD, like that's a disability, and I also have number dyslexia, dyscalculia. Like there are a lot of things that I cannot do. And so I find people who can. And
it's why we got engaged.
It's why we got engaged.
I'm just one human calculator, yes.
Oh, no.
But, no, I think it's totally true, though. It's about, even inside of a relationship, like our relationship, figuring out who's good at what and giving them those jobs and being okay about that. And of course, you have to establish some sense of balance and some sense of fairness. That's been a big journey inside of our relationship. But part of that has been about you getting more and more comfortable with letting me know when you're just maxed out with something. So you're not just trying to keep on doing something that A, you're probably not gonna be able to do very effectively because you're burnt out and you're done and your brain's done. And B is just going to like intensify all of these sensations that you're talking about. So being able to communicate it, I think, is a huge thing to the people who are around you, understanding it inside of yourself so you can communicate it. Medication has helped you a lot.
Yeah.
Also something to name, little very, very low dose Adderall has been a total game changer for you.
Yeah.
That may or may not be true for other people, but there's a lot of stigma around medication.
Yeah.
And, everyone's going to be different. Talk to a psychotherapist about it, talk to a physician about it, whatever it is you need to do. But I would really encourage a lot of people who truly feel like there's some aspect of something that's going on inside of themselves that they cannot address through work inside the mind, through more coping strategies, through whatever. Like if you have a something we've been saying a lot recently is some version of like something. Oh, a chemical problem deserves a chemical solution. Yeah, sometimes you just have a chemistry problem.
Yeah,
and that's ADHD. You got some brain chemistry stuff going on, and hey, if you can get a little chemical in there that just corrects the problem, wow, how amazing is that? Modern medicine. So.
Yeah, and like my graduate school experience was a ton of pain and suffering and just cycles of burnout. And it was actually that experience that made me go, wait a minute, I think this is more than just trauma because I've been doing trauma work for a year, but I still can't focus. Like I still can't sit down and read a book for an hour.
And that's when you got the diagnosis.
And that's when I really advocated for myself and was like, oh, I actually do meet criteria for ADHD. And getting that medication support just made everything so much easier for me. And like, here's the thing. I think what's also helped me is just because I can do something doesn't mean that I should do it. Like, there's a great cost to me when I have to force my brain to do something that it struggles with. Like I can kind of white knuckle it and I can do it, but the degree of dysregulation that I'm going to experience doing that takes a huge toll. Like what this looks like is, there are certain things that I have to do as a part of getting licensed that are very, very challenging for my brain to do. When I'm forced to do them because I have to do them, I set up my life in a way that's going to prepare for the fallout. So I let you know I'm going to probably be a miserable person to be around. Look, it would be great if I could get through this without a panic attack or without like crying uncontrollably several times throughout this experience, but that's just not going to happen. So what do we need to do inside our relationship so that, hey, I'm about to go through something that's going to be just pain and suffering and I have to do it. And so accepting that and then, okay, what do we do to make it a little bearable?
Yeah, having a need is not a moral fault.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people experience having needs as inherently needing to drive a lot of self-criticism and self-loathing and just so much content that we internalize from other people, from the culture, whatever's going on. But just like having a thing that helps you operate better does not make you weak. It doesn't make you, incompetent. It doesn't mean that you haven't done the work yet or whatever it is. It just means that you have a need. And that's really okay. And the in many ways the fastest way to get to where you want to go is really accepting the presence of this need.
Yeah.
And really being okay with whatever outside assistance is required, or inner awareness is required to support you in managing it in a really effective way. Like that's when your life will actually really improve, when you start to being open to and accepting of that kind of help, including the help you give yourself by having a better sense of like when you're maxed or when you're done or when you need to reach out, whatever it is that's going on. Yeah.
And I think like a part of this too is my experience with my diagnoses is that for years, I just tried to force myself to be able to do things like someone who is more neurotypical. And it always led to me being burnt out. It always led to some type of crash. Like it was miserable. And so the more I gained self-awareness, the more I could look at how do I need to set up my life so that it's sustainable for me. And what that looked like was, okay, I can't do some just like back end tech job because one, I don't have the brain for it. And two, if I'm not held accountable, if I don't have to sit and talk with someone, I'm not going to do it. Like I'm just going to procrastinate. I'm not going to do it. So, okay, I need to be face to face with somebody. So I looked at all that and I was like, wow, being a therapist kind of kind of like meets that
checks
criteria.
A lot of those boxes, yeah.
And then throughout that of shaping the life into a way that best suits me, I end up finding my passion. I end up finding things like, wow, my particular symptoms actually like are really good in this like field. And my brain is really good at attuning and noticing patterns, ADHD. And so, wow, like kind of built to be a trauma therapist. And so I think that can also really help people. And I know that that comes from like an immense amount of privilege to be able to kind of shape your life in that way too. But I think there are ways that you can just get really real about things. And then, okay, how aggressive do you want to be in pursuing that?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to beat yourself up all the time to fit inside of a mold that you're never going to fit in anyway.
Yeah, trying to be a fish climbing a tree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are versions of that that can be present for almost anyone.
Mm-hmm.
You might not have the access, the resources, the whatever, the just opportunities in life to have full tuning of what you end up doing. Of course, very few people do. But even inside of an arena, you can normally find some ways to make it a little bit easier, a little bit smoother, a little bit more conducive to you, including just like the things that you choose to do or not do when you're not doing your work. Like, what are the things that are really restorative for you? What are the things that help you take a load off? Whatever it might be for a person.
Mm-hmm.
This has been really great, Elizabeth. I've loved doing this with you. We should totally do this again sometime in the future. Loved the mailbag. We got fantastic questions. And I just always really appreciate how insightful you are and how thoughtful you are about all of this. I also think you're a tremendous therapist. So it's great talking with you about therapy. And I always just really enjoy it.
Well, thanks. I never know how it's going to be. Like, I feel like after we record, I'm always like, like, what did I say? I don't even know.
I blacked out the whole time.
Like, yeah. Like, so hopefully something was useful.
Yeah, I am sure there will be plenty of useful things coming out from this. And again, really just appreciate people listening, watching, giving feedback, asking questions, all of it. It's so great.
Yeah.
I loved talking with Elizabeth today and answering all of these great questions from our listeners. We get incredible questions from people. And it's because we get such great questions that we can approach these topics with so much depth and so much nuance. So we started with a question that focused on the relationship between somatic psychology, somatic approaches to therapy in general, and internal family systems therapy. We then used that, the intersection between these two things, as a way into approaching all of these other questions throughout the conversation. This is the kind of work that Elizabeth does in general with people. This is the framework that she operates from. So it's kind of the basis of everything that she does. Before I go into the rest of the recap, I'd just like to remind you quickly that if you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. It would really help us out. You can also leave a rating and a positive review if you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple. If you're watching the show on YouTube, you can leave a thumbs up, hit the like button. You can subscribe on YouTube. That also really helps us out. Leave a comment for the algorithm, maybe ask a question you would like to hear answered in a future episode of the podcast. And you could also ask us a question through our Patreon account. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a couple of dollars a month, you can support the show and get a bunch of bonuses in return. Okay, so getting into the content of today's episode, we started by thinking of parts work as a framework that many different methodologies of therapy can be applied to. It's a way of thinking about how the mind is constructed in general. And Elizabeth particularly focuses on the relationship between parts and different kinds of nervous system states. What's the part that appears during a certain nervous system state or tends to kind of govern that state? We then talked a lot about parts work in general, including focusing on how we can work with our managers who tend to like to pretend that they are the only show in town and therefore really don't like being observed in general. I then asked her a question about how somebody who is very self-aware, but who hadn't been able to get a lot out of that self-awareness yet. They knew all of this stuff about themselves, but they hadn't been able to actually apply that information to solve their problems. How somebody like that could start to gain more from their self-awareness in a way that was really useful for them. And what we focused on was what that self-awareness might be helping a person evade. Is there an experience that's being avoided by all of that cognizing? Is that thinking in the service of a feeling, or is it there to get around a feeling? There was then a question about functional freezes and dissociation, and what can support somebody in feeling stronger feelings again. There are a bunch of somatic tools that can help people work with functional freeze states, and Elizabeth was interested in the role that the freeze state or emotional numbing in general might be playing in protecting the person from very strong emotions. Is it that this person is truly incapable of feeling strong emotions, or is it that their system is being served by not feeling some feelings that would understandably be really intense? We then answered a question about hypervigilance. And Elizabeth emphasized how we can start by noticing the thoughts we're having when we're in a state of hypervigilance. Are these thoughts feeding the state, or are they helping you get out of the state? And then are there maybe some places where you could invite a different experience? Could you distract yourself in various ways? Could you move your body? Would that help you out? She then made a broader point about how our nervous system is built to move through natural ups and downs, waves of normal activation that happen in the body. And it's normal for us to move through these different body feelings in the course of a day or from day to day. But sometimes it feels like we have this story where we're supposed to feel perfectly normal, perfectly steady, perfectly at ease all of the time. The truth is that would be a profoundly abnormal way of being in the world. Nobody is totally calm and regulated all of the time. And a healthy nervous system is a flexible one. It's one that can ride those waves of ups and downs in a flexible and adaptive kind of way. And in order to do that, we can't try to over control those states. We also don't want to be a total prisoner to them. So it's about finding that healthy middle place. Sometimes hypervigilance can come from trying to control all of the aspects of an experience or an environment, rather than just being able to be with what's happening. Are you able to notice an experience, a sensation in the body, and be with it for long enough to watch it change? Because it always changes. Change is natural, but it can take some time. And this is particularly true for feelings. We can ruminate on a thought almost endlessly, but feelings, those tend to change. We then answered this really interesting question about comparing trauma and the general tendency that people have to measure their experiences against those that other people have. This can lead us to then downplay what's happened to us if we feel like more things have happened to other people. It can also sometimes lead people to feel like they are not being seen in the severity of their experience when they feel like other people's weren't as bad as theirs were. And we talked about the desire to feel seen, to be included, and to feel validated in the things that have happened to us. And Elizabeth shared a bit about that from her own perspective and her own journey. The final question we got was about Elizabeth, just kind of in general, and the things that have helped her become a therapist while also being somebody with ADHD, complex PTSD, PMDD, as I say sometimes during episodes, the whole alphabet soup. And she named a number of things. For starters, she had strong social support, medication, a relationship that she could lean on, a lot of advantages here. These are various forms of privilege. For example, we were economically stable in addition to everything else. And then there were these things that she also did inside of herself, which included learning how to respect her limitations and set up a life where she stopped pretending that she was this like perfectly neurotypical person who could do things exactly the same way that everybody else could. Instead, she had specific needs. And it was only when she was able to accept the presence of those different needs, which therefore supported her in meeting them, that things got a lot easier and more doable for her. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I always love talking with Elizabeth. As I mentioned at the start of the recap, if you want to ask us a question, you can do so through Patreon and the comments on YouTube, or you can send us an email to contact@beingwellpodcast.com. If you want to hear more from Elizabeth about a particular topic, also please let us know. That helps really guide me in the content that I end up producing for people. I want to make stuff that you're going to get a lot of value out of. And the best way to figure out what that is by just asking you and hopefully getting a response in return. I really love doing this work. I've gotten so much out of it personally, and I'm always just so grateful that there are so many people who are engaged with it in a way that allows us to produce content like this. So, again, thank you. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.